Harry Truman was eating breakfast and reading the Washington Post when he saw a shocking headline. It said that Secretary of State James Burns had made major agreements with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov in Moscow. There was a new plan for controlling atomic energy, compromises about Eastern Europe, and changes to how Japan would be governed after the war. Truman slowly put down his coffee. His hands were shaking. He was the President of the United States, yet he was finding out about important foreign policy decisions from a newspaper. His Secretary of State had not talked to him, briefed him, or even called him. It seemed like James Burns was making foreign policy on his own. As Truman looked at the headlines, he understood that this was more than simple disobedience. It was a public embarrassment, one meant for the whole world to see. James Francis Burns did not just dislike Harry Truman. He looked at the man from Missouri and believed he was a historical accident, someone who became president by chance. This feeling began in July 1944 at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Franklin Roosevelt was running for a fourth term, even though his health was clearly getting worse. Everyone understood that whoever became vice president would probably soon become president. At that time, Burns was Roosevelt's director of war mobilization. Newspapers even called him the assistant president. He had more influence than almost any cabinet member in modern American history. Burns believed he deserved to be vice president. He had helped Roosevelt win South Carolina in every election since 1932. He had managed the war economy very successfully. Most importantly, Roosevelt had promised him the position. In 1944, many people at the Democratic Convention believed Harry Truman was a nobody. He was just a senator from Missouri. He had led a committee that investigated war production, but he was quiet, simple, and not very well known. Truman was not powerful or controversial. He had no strong enemies. Party leaders liked him because he was loyal, capable, and ordinary. After the strong and dramatic personality of Roosevelt, Truman seemed calm and safe. He did not threaten anyone's power. In fact, he was chosen because he seemed so unremarkable. When party leaders told President Roosevelt they could not accept James Burns as vice president, Roosevelt did not argue. Burns was seen as too controversial and had too many enemies, especially among labor groups. Roosevelt wrote a note saying he would be satisfied with either Truman or Supreme Court Justice William Douglas. This gave party leaders permission to remove Burns from consideration. Burns didn't even hear the news directly. A reporter asked him how he felt about being passed over. That was how he found out. On July 21, 1944, the convention chose Harry Truman as the vice presidential candidate. Burns sat alone in his hotel room. He felt more than humiliation. He felt forgotten. The applause for Truman sounded to him like the end of his own career. The presidency he believed he deserved was given to a man from Missouri he barely knew. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly. James Burns was on a train traveling from South Carolina to Washington when he heard the news during a stop at a station. The president was dead, and Harry Truman was being sworn in as the new president. Standing on the platform, with steam from the train rising around him, Burns felt sure of one thing. The country was now in the hands of an amateur. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. He knew very little about the war, the atomic bomb, or the agreements Roosevelt had made with Stalin and Churchill. Burns, however, knew all of it. He had worked closely with Roosevelt for years. He had even traveled to the Yalta Conference. He believed he understood the Soviet Union and the global situation much better than Truman. Burns felt that the wrong man was becoming president. The person who should have taken the oath, in his mind, was riding on that train. Instead, the job went to a former haberdasher who had met Roosevelt only twice as vice president. On that train platform, Burns made a decision. Truman would need him. He believed Truman could not handle foreign policy without someone who understood Roosevelt's plans. Years earlier, Burns had been Truman's mentor in the Senate. He assumed that relationship would continue, the teacher guiding the student, even if the student was now sitting in the Oval Office. In early July 1945, Truman offered James Burns the job of Secretary of State. Many people in Washington saw it as a consolation prize, but Burns did not accept the job to serve Truman. He believed he was accepting it to protect the country from Truman. Truman wanted to continue Roosevelt's policy toward Stalin. Burns had been at the Yalta Conference and knew what Roosevelt had promised. He believed he was the right person to handle that relationship. However, Burns saw his role differently than Truman did. He believed he would be the real decision-maker in foreign policy. In his mind, Truman would simply approve what he decided. At Burns's swearing-in ceremony on July 3, 1945, Truman gave a short speech. He said he was lucky to have such an experienced Secretary of State. Burns barely reacted. He was already thinking ahead to the upcoming Potsdam Conference. The struggle for power had already started, but Truman did not realize it yet. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Burns made his first important move. Truman was meeting with Stalin and Churchill to decide the future of Europe after the war. It was Truman's first big test as president, and he needed Burns's experience. But Burns did not fully prepare Truman. He did not clearly explain how Stalin negotiated. He did not warn him about Churchill's strong efforts to stop Soviet control of Eastern Europe. Instead, Burns often held private meetings with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. In these side meetings, he made early agreements. Later, he presented them to Truman as if they were already settled. At first, this seemed small. Burns would tell Truman that Stalin agreed to something, but only if the United States agreed to something in return. Truman would approve, believing he was simply confirming a fair deal. Later, he realized that Burns had sometimes promised things to Stalin before asking for his approval. Churchill noticed what was happening. During the conference, he pulled Truman aside and warned him that Burns was making promises without clear permission from the president. Truman did not take the warning seriously. Burns was his Secretary of State, so he believed Burns had the authority to negotiate. Churchill said nothing more, but he had seen this kind of situation before. When advisors think they are smarter than their leaders, it usually does not end well. In December 1945, James Burns traveled to Moscow for an important meeting of foreign ministers. He was going to discuss major issues: control of atomic energy, U.S. policy in Japan, and whether to recognize Soviet-backed governments in Eastern Europe. These were some of the most serious foreign policy questions facing the United States. Before he left, Burns promised Truman that he would stay in contact. He said he would ask for approval before making major decisions and that he would strongly defend American interests. But he did not keep those promises. For 2 weeks in Moscow, Burns negotiated directly with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. He made compromises on atomic energy. He softened the U.S. position on governments in Eastern Europe. He changed parts of American policy in Japan, and he never once consulted Truman. This brings the story back to Truman's breakfast table. While Burns was meeting and celebrating with Molotov in Moscow, Truman was at home reading about these decisions in the morning newspapers. The State Department had told him nothing. The Washington Post reported that Burns had agreed to recognize Soviet-backed governments in Romania and Bulgaria. The New York Times reported that he had made concessions on atomic energy cooperation. Truman was learning about his own administration's policies from the headlines. When Burns returned from Moscow, Truman called him to a meeting on the presidential yacht, the USS Williamsburg, on January 5, 1946. The yacht was anchored in cold winter fog. Truman sat alone in the main cabin. He was not angry in a loud way. He was calm and quiet, the kind of quiet that shows someone has reached their limit. Burns arrived feeling confident. He believed he had been successful in Moscow and had continued Roosevelt's policy of working with Stalin. But Truman did not want a full report. On the table between them was a stack of newspapers. All of them had stories about Burns's agreements in Moscow. Burns began to explain the results of the conference, but Truman stopped him. "I've been reading about your conference in the newspapers," Truman said. His voice was low and controlled. Burns tried to defend himself. He said communication had been difficult. The time difference made it hard to stay in contact. He insisted he had acted in America's best interest. Truman picked up a newspaper and read the headline about recognizing the Romanian government. He asked Burns when he had planned to tell the president about this decision. Burns replied that he was telling him now. Truman's hands tightened around the paper. His voice stayed calm, but his words were sharp. "I would not have appointed you," Truman said, "if I had thought you would take the powers of the president." In that moment, Burns realized something. Truman was not weak or easily controlled. He knew he had been ignored and betrayed. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Burns's position in the administration had changed, even if he did not fully understand it yet. For the next year, Burns seemed to follow Truman's instructions. He contacted him more often, sent regular messages, and gave briefings before major talks. But in reality, Burns had not truly changed. He had only become better at hiding what he was doing. He still acted as if he were in charge of foreign policy. Often, he made early agreements first and then presented them to Truman as suggestions, while also making it clear that changing them would cause diplomatic problems. In private meetings with foreign leaders, he made promises and later described them as simple discussions. Most importantly, Burns continued to believe his judgment was better than Truman's. When Truman wanted to take a stronger stand against Soviet expansion, Burns quietly softened that position during negotiations. Truman began receiving reports from other officials in the State Department. Career diplomats were uncomfortable with how independently Burns was acting. They told Truman that Burns was making decisions without proper approval. Foreign governments were unsure whether Burns or Truman truly spoke for the United States. The Soviets were taking advantage of this confusion. By mid-1946, Truman had to make a choice. He could continue to accept a Secretary of State who ignored his authority, or he could remove the rival who refused to act like a subordinate. This fight between Truman and Burns was not just about pride or personal conflict. While they argued, Stalin was changing the map of Europe. By 1946, it was clear what the Soviets wanted in Eastern Europe. Stalin was installing communist governments everywhere. Free elections promised at Yalta were being blocked, and opposition leaders were arrested or killed. In Poland, Soviet forces arrested leaders of the Home Army, the resistance that had fought the Nazis for 6 years. Thousands were sent to labor camps. In Czechoslovakia, the democratic government was under pressure and a communist takeover was coming. Truman saw the truth. Stalin did not want cooperation, he wanted control. Burns, however, still believed negotiation could work. He thought Stalin could be persuaded through compromise and that Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation was still possible. This wasn't just a disagreement over tactics, it was a disagreement about reality itself. Truman believed Stalin respected only strength. Burns believed Stalin would respond to conciliation. Because of Burns, U.S. diplomats in Moscow were taking a softer position than Truman wanted, and Allied governments were confused about America's resolve. Truman realized he needed a Secretary of State who would carry out his policy, and Burns would not do that. On March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Truman sat on the stage behind him. He had invited Churchill knowing what he would say. Churchill delivered the line that would define the era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. He spoke about Soviet control over Eastern Europe and called for Western unity and strength. He said the Soviets respected military power, not compromise. Truman had approved every word beforehand. This was his policy, announced through one of the most respected leaders of the war. Burns was in the audience and was shocked. The speech went against everything he had been trying to do. Afterward, he confronted Truman, saying the speech was unnecessarily provocative. Truman answered simply, "That was the point." Burns realized then that the rules had changed. Truman would not continue Roosevelt's approach to Stalin. He would confront Soviet expansion. Burns now had a choice: carry out Truman's policy or leave. In January 1947, James Burns resigned as Secretary of State. He said it was for health reasons, claiming he was exhausted from 2 years of constant travel and negotiations, and that his doctor recommended rest. Nobody believed him. Truman had made it clear that he needed a Secretary of State who shared his vision. Through a series of pointed conversations, Truman gave Burns the chance to leave voluntarily rather than being publicly fired. Burns understood the choice. On January 21, 1947, Truman accepted Burns' resignation and issued a statement praising his service, saying the American people owed him gratitude. It was a polite formality. But Burns was not leaving because of health. He was leaving because Truman, the former haberdasher, had finally removed the powerful statesman. Truman had already chosen Burns' replacement, George C. Marshall, the commander of American forces during World War II and one of the most respected military leaders in the country. Marshall would follow orders, respect the chain of command, and carry out Truman's policy. The change was immediate. Within days, U.S. foreign policy shifted from trying to accommodate the Soviets to actively containing them. George Marshall became Secretary of State on January 21, 1947. Within a few months, he announced the European Recovery Program, later called the Marshall Plan. The plan gave massive economic aid to rebuild Western Europe, strengthen democratic governments, and prevent communist parties from taking advantage of poverty and desperation. This was Truman's policy of containment in action. Instead of trying to cooperate with Stalin, the U.S. was now competing strategically. Marshall carried out the policy skillfully. He worked with Congress, gained support from both parties, and clearly explained the strategy. The plan succeeded. Western Europe recovered, communist influence weakened, and Soviet expansion was slowed. Barnes, watching from South Carolina, saw the policy he had opposed succeed. Marshall was putting Truman's vision into action. Barnes had believed that cooperating with Stalin was possible, but Marshall showed that strength and economic power worked better. Truman had been right about Stalin. Barnes had been wrong. The firing of James Burns showed the strong resolve of the Missouri senator. There was no public argument, no media spectacle, just a calm and firm removal of an obstacle. This approach became Truman's pattern throughout his presidency. 5 years later, Douglas MacArthur would learn the same lesson when he publicly challenged Truman's policy in Korea. The lesson was simple. The president sets policy, and cabinet members or generals must carry it out. If they refuse, they leave. Burns had thought his experience and skill made him indispensable. Truman proved that no one is indispensable. Only the president is. After leaving the State Department, James Burns returned to South Carolina and became governor in 1951. He opposed desegregation and resisted the civil rights movement. While he remained influential in Southern politics, he never held national office again. The presidency he thought he deserved in 1944 was never within his reach. Burns died in 1972 at age 89. His obituaries remembered his time as Secretary of State and praised his wartime service, but few noted that he had been forced out by a president. Even fewer understood why. Burns had made a fundamental mistake. He believed experience and expertise mattered more than authority. He thought his skill gave him the right to set policy. Truman taught him otherwise. In a constitutional system, authority comes from democratic legitimacy. The president is elected, and cabinet members are appointed. When Burns forgot that, Truman reminded him firmly. In the end, the man who once thought he should be president learned a simple truth. Thinking you should be president is not the same as actually being president.